Welcome to another episode of the On the Way podcast, a podcast exploring a non-violent, non-dualistic, compassionate faith life. My name is Dom Fay. We are recording via Zoom today with an interstate guest, but we also have Peter and Sue jumping in via Zoom, properly socially distanced. Peter, what's the Zoom background you're working with here today that I can see?
My Zoom background is Siena in Italy.
Yep.
It's part of my grieving process for the holiday I'm not going to get in October.
Yeah.
I keep beating myself up by showing myself pictures I've taken in Italy.
And Sue, we're coming to you in the office with the bookshelf behind you. Have you, I noticed that I had this with a bookshelf early on in the Zoom meetings that I had to remove some of the maybe less prestigious books from behind me. I needed to make sure I had the most impressive
I haven't
reads.
zoomed in, so I'm hoping it's far enough away that I'm free of judgment. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, look, we're very excited to have a guest joining us today who is something of a national treasure. I think it would be fair to say. Social researcher and author Hugh Mackay, zooming into the On the Way podcast. Hugh, thank you for making time and for joining us.
Great pleasure. Lovely to be here. Thank you, Dom.
So where are you based in the country right now in the middle of this pandemic, Hugh?
Canberra, which has been home for the last 3 years, and that's in my background. Well, it's in my foreground in my life now, but it's in my background on the Zoom.
Lovely. Okay. Well, the reason we're joining you for this conversation today, Hugh, is because you have two new books that have recently come out. There's a novel called The Question of Love and a non-fiction work, The Inner Self. And they have similar thematic ideas. We're going to spend most of today discussing the non-fiction work, The Inner Self, but we're going to also draw on some of the themes of the novel as well. It's fascinating work. We've all had the chance to look through it in the recent weeks, the Inner Self. Can you just talk us through, because obviously the book, to put it in a nutshell, I suppose, is about connecting with and exploring and knowing the true self, the true essence of who we are, not the labels and identities and masks that most of society has most of the time. Can you just, I guess, give us an insight into what led you into exploring this sort of work in these areas?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dom. And in fact, you just captured my motivation in that brief summary, because I've spent all my working life really as a social psychologist, as a researcher, looking at how society functions, how people respond to social change, how people interact with each other, all concerned very much with externals, and with, I mean, identity is the fashionable word at the moment. In fact, it's become too fashionable, and I think dangerously. But where most of us are, particularly in the first half of our lives, primarily concerned with our identity. And identity is an interesting word. In this book, I wanted to draw a very sharp distinction between identity and self, because identity is the exterior. It's like the shell, the outer shell, and it's all about, the very word captures it. It's all about how different we are. It's how we identify ourselves and discriminate between Dom and Sue and Peter and Hugh. And all these differences are, of course, fascinating. One of the most interesting things parents discover is that they can have 2 or 3 or 4 kids and they can be so different from each other. And that's all about identity. It's all about externalities, physical appearance. As we move through adolescence into adulthood, our identity consists of things like the person we might choose as a partner, or whether or not we decide to have children, what kind of job we might do, what sort of style we might adopt. But for most of us, there comes a time, and it often seems to come around about the midlife. In fact, the classic textbook midlife crisis is often, I think, about this very thing. There comes a point where we realize that all that stuff about identity, all that stuff about the differences between us, is not the full story. That there is an inner, deeper sense of self, which is often at variance with this outer identity. And as we mature, when there is the sense of a gap between who I really am deep within me and how I appear to other people, that gap creates a lot of tension. People often feeling a sense of restlessness or anxiety or even despair without being able to identify where it came from. But this is where it classically comes from. So this is a very long answer to your question, Don, but can I just make one other point to absolutely explain what I see as the difference between the outer self and the inner self. So the outer self is all about difference. The inner self, when we go deeply inside ourselves, of course, there are some things about us which are unique to us. But when we get right down to the absolute essence of who I am, who you are, what we discover is a bit of a paradox. What we discover is that it's actually nothing to do with our uniqueness. It's all to do with our common humanity. It's all to do with what it's like to belong to a species, in this case, the human species, which is by its very nature a social species. That is to say, we're hopeless in isolation. We need each other. We need families, neighborhoods, congregations, choirs, book clubs, workplaces, footy teams. That's our natural situation, to be in a group or a community, a collection of people, because that's how social species don't just survive, but thrive. It's why, for example, in our criminal justice system, the worst possible punishment we can inflict on anyone in Australia is solitary confinement, because that is the worst punishment you can inflict on a member of a social species. So this is the absolute essence of what the book is about, that when you go deep, you discover it's all about connection. It's all about our common humanity, as opposed to the shallow, more exterior appearance of difference.
It's really well put there, and it ties in with an idea we've sort of discussed on the podcast before. There's two themes that have come through this podcast regularly. One is the lie of the individual myth, I suppose, and the other is ties in with the baptismal call that Peter talks about to your unique self, who you are, in this universe. I just might ask you, Peter, can you discuss a little bit, because when we talk about in Christianity, I know this theme comes through a lot, that we're all unique, everyone is made unique, but not in the way that maybe culture views that in terms of an individual project, an individual self. You are unique and you're out there to go and conquer and achieve the personal project. Can you just talk about what the difference between maybe what we mean by this sort of baptismal call to your unique self, but not disconnected or removed from others?
Yeah, I think what we soon discover, and it starts with the baptismal liturgy, when we realise that to be my true and best self, I have to be in deep and meaningful relationships with others. And those other relationships will shape me. Sometimes they will deform me, because we get formed and deformed by other people. But in the end, I will be the product of my unique self in relationship with others. And it's the thing I am constantly struck by in funerals, is when people are giving eulogies, one very quickly realises you've got several hundred people gathered together who would not be who they are today if they hadn't had that wonderful relationship they'd had with the person who is deceased. And one of the things that dawns for people during a funeral is that they are still in relationship with the deceased, that they are so deeply formed and connected through life that death actually cannot separate them. So they carry the other person corporately. At a funeral, we actually remember. We put the deceased person back together because they are amongst us and with us. And we get that same beautiful moment in the Eucharist. In fact, as I was presiding this morning, I had one of those really magic moments when I realised that as the broken bread was being distributed, we were all equal. and yet but our equality didn't cause our difference to evaporate. There was a beautiful individuality, but such a deep connection through sharing Eucharist, all standing, literally, quite figuratively in this case because of COVID, but standing together, being formed by a common story, and being transformed and being set free to be our true selves while having that experience in community, and only having that experience through community.
I remember
it's a paradox. You sort of discover your true self when you're in community with other people. It's
and that's what you touched on, Hugh, saying the paradox at the heart of this book is that we look inside to find our uniqueness, and instead we find our common humanity. And I know that particularly in Western culture, my memories of growing up are probably not too dissimilar to yours. Of you're very quickly put into the subjects you're good at, and then you find your unique self in the hobbies you have, and there's all these identity markers: what band you're into, did you get married young or old or not at all these sort of identity markers that define you as a unique person. And then, as you said, you reach a certain stage in life, many people do, where they realize that those unique markers are something of a myth or a construction, and there's something bigger, deeper going on beneath it all. But I'm just curious, because in the book you do use the example of the British actress Emma Thompson and her story of how she reached her 60th birthday, I think it was, and she started to realize that the who am I question, after a life of success and identity markers, that who is really looking out through these eyes, who really is inside here, kind of captivated her. Did you have a clear memory of when that question and this area really captivated you from a really personal point of view?
Yes, and I think too late in life. I wish that I'd had the classic I think I did have a bit of a midlife crisis, but I didn't get what it was really about. It was associated with the breakdown of a marriage and a remarriage subsequently. And I suppose I thought that's what it was about, but of course that wasn't what it was really about. I think I wasn't really, I was a bit like Emma Thompson. I was into my 60s before I really began to get this idea of, and Peter expressed it beautifully in describing his magic moment this morning, this tension between myself as an independent, unique being, which I am, and my utter interdependence on others, which is equally true of me. But I think that the deeper layer of this conversation is that when we're going into, and this is what I think came to me too late, but when we're going deeply into ourselves and discovering that that our essence is about our commonness, about our connectedness, the fact that we are part of the greater whole called humanity. The essence of that, it's not just a kind of an intellectual, oh, isn't that interesting, we're all part of one species. It is to realize that we have a duty to that species, and that duty is to be loving. That at the very core of the self is the capacity for compassion, kindness, respect towards others. And I think the breakthrough moment for anyone on this journey is when we realize that that's actually what we're for. That's what it is to be human, and it has nothing whatever to do with affection. It's how we make sense of some of the sayings attributed to Jesus. For example, loving enemies doesn't mean you would feel some kind of emotional, positive feeling towards enemies. It means that your reserves of compassion as a human being are like a discipline that you have to exert, and they are inexhaustible. And whether it's someone that you really don't like, someone you could never agree with about religion or politics or music or whatever, they're human too. And we are being truly human we are being at our human best when we've understood that our essence is to be, of course, the groups, the families, the congregations, the communities, the groups, these things can't work unless enough of us are committed to the idea that we must promote social harmony. And we can only promote social harmony by showing kindness and respect towards everyone we encounter, not just people for whom we have positive emotional feelings. Of course, positive emotional feelings are wonderful. I'm not against that, but it's an absolute red herring when you're talking about the essence of what it means to be human.
Actually, Hugh, you use the phrase somewhere in there of taking one another seriously, taking everyone seriously. And I love that as a phrase, because we often talk about treating people with respect, and we hear it so often. I think sometimes you need to hear it in a slightly different way. And if you talk about taking everyone you meet seriously, then I think that gives a weight to the other person and an importance and an honor to the other person. So that was one of my takeaway lines from your work. And I think it can really be a tilt, a lens that can be very helpful.
Yes. Thanks, Sue. I think we're probably there touching on what I believe to be the greatest of all human needs, the need to be taken seriously. Whether you're a little child or an 82-year-old, all of us, anywhere on the age spectrum or the socio-cultural or economic or any other spectrum, we all have at the deepest level this need to be heard, to be attended to be acknowledged, to be recognized, to be responded to. Because if no one else is responding to me, then I have this awful sense that I'm not connected, that I'm not part of the thing I'm supposed to be part of. And I think that deep need to be taken seriously is a reflection of the fact that our primary duty as humans is to love.
It's an interesting point, I suppose, because it is all about the energy with which you approach any of these things, or the angle you're looking at them from. Because if you are thinking about your own personal uniqueness and your identity markers, you can hear things like love your enemies and the human work to love each other. And you can hear that as an individual call to you that, oh, I need to work harder on my loving. I need to be a more loving person. I need to be looked at and seen as more loving. It becomes another individual project of how can I be better and tick more boxes and be looked on more favorably. And then maybe at the end, someone will give me a report card and say, congratulations, you're in the top 5% of the loving people in the world when you're alive. That's a pretty good effort, in you come, or something along those lines. Whereas I suppose what you're speaking of here is, and I know this is classic Christian idea of dying to self to find yourself. That kind of idea that actually when you're able to give up the individual project and this idea that getting that report card is ever going to be something that actually happens in this world, that is when you are then able to actually do those things. Is that kind of a paradox as you see it here?
Yes. Yeah, I love that little journey you just went on, Dom, because there is a real trap in this kind of discussion, and you can see it. It often, there are books being published this very year that capture this idea that we need to be kind to other people because that's good for us. What will make you happy is if you can show compassion towards other people. Now, this makes my flesh creep. This has nothing to do with virtue. This has nothing to do with compassion. If I'm exploiting someone else's need in order to increase my happiness quotient, there's no virtue in it at all. I mean, this is not about me. It's not about my report card. It's not about ticking the boxes or getting first-class honours at the end of my life. It's simply about acknowledging that I live for others because I'm human. Gandhi captured it in a quote that I've used in the book when he said, the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others. Well, I mean, the most important part of that quote, of course, is finding yourself in the service of others. It's about, it is I see this just as quite a tough mental discipline. You know, this is a commitment. It's a commitment you make to a certain way of being in the world, which has nothing to do with being a good guy, nothing to do with the reward you get for this. You might get a reward. I mean, sometimes when you behave compassionately towards someone, particularly someone in obvious need, you might get a little kick out of it, but equally you might not. You might be helping someone out at an extremely inconvenient moment. You know, they might have, a frail elderly person might have dropped their shopping bag outside the supermarket, and obviously they need help, but it's pouring with rain and you're running late for a meeting, and you're going to help them because you're human. You're going to help them get sorted out and on their way, but you're not going to get any pleasure out of that. You're not going to get home soaked to the skin saying, well, that was terrific. I'm really glad. They're going to say, what a nuisance. You know, I could have done without that, but yeah, just footnote, but I'm human. So I didn't have to think twice about whether I would pause and help. That's what a human does. And what's remarkable, and in fact sometimes makes the news, is when humans don't respond to someone who's in obvious need. It's so natural for us, when we're being true to ourselves, to behave compassionately. However, it is a demand. And I don't think that's too strong a word, which is why I think when we honestly look inside ourselves, we don't just see that we are imbued with a loving spirit, that's who we are. We also see that this is going to make demands on us. This is going to call on us to live in a certain way, which isn't always going to be easy, like the burst shopping bag in the rainstorm. Not easy. And greater challenges, dealing with relationships which have become tricky or difficult, or dealing with people who are experiencing mental illness. And so it is very demanding to be loving all the time, which is why we hide from that demand. I think of the loving spirit within us as being like the light that animates us, warms us, and literally enlightens us, gives us a purpose for living, etc. But like the sun, like all bright lights, it casts terrible shadows, which is why in our folklore we talk about the fine line between love and hate, why people in loving relationships can experience dreadful possessiveness, jealousy, desire for revenge. You know, all sorts of things exist within us because we are illuminated by compassion. And it's like people who in a particular setting know what is the right thing to do but decide not to do it. That's human. We sometimes do that. We sometimes slip into the shadows so we don't have to respond directly to the light.
Well, speaking of these hiding places, Hugh, you actually in the book you list the top 20 places that we tend to go to hide from our true inner self, to hide from this call to love. And you know, and it is interesting when you actually look at the ones you've listed. I'll just rattle through them, and then we'll look at a few in particular. You write that addiction, ambition, anxiety, arrogance, busyness, complacency, and certainty, fantasy, fatalism, forgetting, guilt and shame, pursuit of happiness, information technology, masks and labels, materialism, nostalgia, perfectionism, projection, religion and science, victimhood and work are the top 20 places, or 20 of the top places that we can very easily. It's almost as if there's a big playing field here of the love and the pain of what it is to be alive and to be a human. And then there's 20 bunkers set up around the outside. And a lot of us spend our time in those bunkers, not wanting to be out on the field doing the actual work of being alive. And just looking at a bunch of those, some might surprise people because I think they're still very much, there'd probably be an acceptance in Western society that addiction, for example, is not a healthy thing. But I don't think there'd be the same acceptance in Western society that ambition is not a healthy thing. Ambition is seen as a virtue. Ambition is seen as something you should have and possess and aim for. So maybe just starting with ambition, well, where do you see that as being a hiding place from our inner self?
Yes, thanks, Tom. And by the way, when you read through the list, that reminds me to say that not all of these places are necessarily hiding places. We might, for example, later talk about religion and science. Well, they are not necessarily hiding places, but they become hiding places if we use them to hide from the loving spirit within. So, yes, ambition is a lovely one to start with, because here is a classic case of how ambition can be fueled by love, or it can be fueled by ego. And so it becomes a hiding place when it's protecting us from the demand to be compassionate, kind, respectful, inclusive, tolerant towards other people, and becomes a narrow focus to do with me getting what I want. Now, let's take a political example, not a personal example, but a theoretical. You can think of someone, one of the things that's kind of regarded almost as an axiom in politics is no one ever becomes prime minister without having been driven by the lifelong ambition to become prime minister. Now, I'm not sure that's literally true, but I've had that proposition put to me. Now, let's examine the ambition to be prime minister. That can be a loving ambition, or it can be an ego-driven. It can be all about, I want to be prime minister because that's the biggest job in the country. If I'm prime minister, no one can say I didn't get to the top of the heap. I want to be prime minister. That's like saying I want to be, maybe Peter harbours this dark ambition to become an archbishop and primate. So he can be primate.
In my nightmares.
This seems deeply improbable, but you can see what I'm saying. I mean, imagine being driven by that as an ambition. Yeah. So I just want that job, versus the person who says, I want to eradicate poverty. I want to eliminate the gap between the genders in the workplace or in our culture. Or I want to be sure that there is no more homelessness, or I want to restore more of an egalitarian ethos to our society. In order to do that, I might have to become prime minister. And there might even be some reluctance about it. But there is an ambition to which I would give a big tick and say that is an ambition born of compassion. Whereas the ambition to have the top job because I want to have the top job is a hiding place from the self. That's denying our humanity. It's denying the loving spirit within. I've heard school teachers sometimes be criticised for their lack of ambition. One of my own teachers in primary school told me long after I'd left primary school, I remained in contact with her, that people criticised her for her lack of ambition because she refused promotion. She'd been offered the opportunity to become a school principal in various locations. She turned all this down because, as she put it eloquently and beautifully, my ambition is for my pupils. She wanted to be a person in charge of a class devoted to teaching children life skills, flourishing skills. She wanted to nurture young minds. So it sounds a bit grandiose, but that was her ambition. It had absolutely nothing to do with her status in the world or her income or whether people would say, oh, she did very well, she became the principal of a school. She would say, judge whether I did well or not by what became of my pupils.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you look through these hiding places that you list, things such as busyness come up as well. And in the book, you actually, you touch on maybe what we've been talking about here as well. You write, you ask the question, how often do we find ourselves happily indulging in some trivial pursuit, even though a deeper awareness is whispering to us of its futility? How often do we observe ourselves engaged in serious conversation while another part of us silently acknowledges our words to be a vain attempt to uphold a comfortable illusion that we do not really believe in? And I'm sure, as I say, that there'll be people who, probably everyone listening to this, can have some moment of connecting to that we spend a lot of our lives pursuing things. And, you know, a really good way, I think, of putting it is how you put it. We spend a lot of our lives hiding from what's really going on here and what we really feel that we're meant to be here to do. But it's just so tempting and so easy and so habitual to hide. Why is it such a habitual thing for us to want to fall into one of those hiding places?
Well, there are many answers to that. I suppose the main one is, once you find a hiding place which protects you from the demands of compassion, the demands of love on you, that can become very comfortable. And the longer you stay there, the more reluctant you'll become to come out again into the light. And this would be a particular problem, Dom, if other people praise you for what you're doing. Now, you mentioned busyness in passing a moment ago, and that's another really classic example of a hiding place. It allows us not only to hide from ourselves, but to hide from each other. I mean, busyness, as long as you're on that treadmill, you don't even have to ask why you're on the treadmill. You just have to keep running. Busyness is the great barrier to social cohesion, because busyness is a very preoccupying thing. But in our culture, weirdly, although the pandemic of 2020 has actually hit the pause button for many people and caused them to rethink this very point, but the culture had got to the stage where we had even changed the way we greet each other. Instead of saying, "How are you going, Dom?" we would be saying, "How are you going, Dom? Busy?" As though this is the great virtue. You know, the switch has to be on or off. Are you busy or are you dead? And busyness is something that people praise. You know, don't disturb Daddy, he's busy.
Yeah,
you know, I'm so busy I don't have time to scratch myself. You know, well, there's some pretty good responses you could make to that, like, are you really that inefficient? Can't you get your work done more efficiently than that? Or why have you allowed this to happen? But in our culture, we praise busyness, we kind of indulge it. And so someone who's hiding from the self, and indeed from others, you know, even from a partner or from their own kids through their busyness, gets rewarded for it, because the boss thinks they're putting in an enormous amount of effort, or their income is reflecting their busyness, or they're just comfortable not having to think about who they really are or what they're becoming.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. I remember saying a few years ago to a friend that I felt like I'd gone through a whole year of conversations where every bit of small talk or introduction I had was just me and the person I was talking to, whoever it was, talking about how busy we were at the moment.
Yeah.
It was almost a competition, who's busier. So they would say,
right.
well, I was working 12-hour days this week. And then I'd say, well, I was working a 14-hour day, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Or it became this competition. Who's juicing the most out of this life?
Yes.
Yet I know my own experiences, and I imagine this echoes many, is that when I look back at you know, the busier periods of my life, I also see the periods that felt the shallowest, felt like I wasn't really going very deep in a particular sense.
Yes.
I might also say, though, that I think I have lots of conversations with people who know that they don't want to be this busy, and we've actually created structures in our society that are set up for this kind of relentless work and relentless scheduling of things. And I think particularly of teachers at the moment, and of course during COVID, it's been so much worse. The workload that teachers have been carrying has been incredible, and they know they don't want to be on that busy schedule. They would like to be able to get off. But there are just so many constraints on them finding a different path. And I think we all need to look at ourselves, not just individually, but societally as well. What structures we've created that feed that.
Yes. Well, look, I think that's a wonderful point to make, and emphasises the fact that busyness is not necessarily a hiding place. As I've said of most of the others on the list, it's only a hiding place if we use it in that way. But people who have been forced by circumstances, teachers are a classic example at the moment, to be relentlessly, kind of helplessly busy, are clearly not intending to hide from themselves. They have had this thrust upon them, and they're trying to deal with it. And I agree. I think that is a challenge then for all of us to ask, how did we let this happen to other people around us? In the same way as how did we let loneliness happen to people around us? How are we a society in which 25% of the population say they feel lonely most of every week? That's not their problem. That's our problem. That's the problem of, as you say, it's a societal problem. And of course, if you are trapped in, for example, busyness involuntarily, the real challenge is to find time to remember to go inside, to replenish the resources of compassion. So when people say, I'm just running on empty, I'm at the end of my tether, that's really what they're saying. I've run out of compassion.
Mm. And I feel
your book is really helpful, or the analysis in your book is really helpful, because it invites us not only to look at the individual, but as Sue has said just then about the corporate nature. Mm. And so the very things that you're applying to the individual also need to be applied to the culture. So the culture builds ways of hiding. As a culture, we hide from ourselves, and we even hide the nature of our culture from ourselves. In Australia, one of the conversations that's only just starting to happen is the conversation around our history and the way we treated the First Nations when we arrived. Mm-hmm. And we have been hiding from ourselves, and so we've been doing a whole lot of. We've got our own corporate hiding places, like football, Anzacs. We hide behind these things as a way so that as Australians we don't get to look at the question of, so who are we?
Yes,
it becomes a corporate act as well as an individual act. So and your hiding places, when you look at them, nostalgia. I mean, there was a real attempt, which has been defeated by COVID, I suspect. But that idea that we'd have around the Australia trip of a Captain Cook lookalike to celebrate 250 years. That's sort of that grasping for the nation that we think was, and that's just nostalgia hiding us, helping us to hide from who we are and who we're becoming. Because as with the individual, when the individual starts to go deep, they have to confront things about themselves that are disturbing. Mm-hmm. As a national culture, we use nostalgia as a way of masking some of the things we have to come to terms with, and some of the horror on which our story should be based, but the horror that's actually omitted from our narrative.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. And, we can put two N words together to get something very dangerous for any society: nostalgia and nationalism. Yeah. And we are somewhat in the grip of both of those. And it is, as you say, it is just on a larger scale, it's a way of hiding from the truth about who we really are. Our treatment of First Peoples being a classic example, but even currently, our treatment of asylum seekers and refugees in general, whether in detention or even in the community. The sort of Damoclean sword of the temporary protection visa, etc. There are lots of ways in which, as a society, we are hiding from the truth about how we treat people in need. And it's easy to hide, particularly if our leaders are encouraging us to hide.
If they shut off communications and things, and we don't actually hear the stories, and we're able to put people away from us out of public view and out of media inquiry.
Yes, that's right. Keep them hidden. Never mention their names, and kind of pretend it isn't a problem anymore. And of course, to some extent, it works. I mean, that's I guess the point Peter's making. If we are encouraged to hide from a truth about ourselves, which might be a bit painful to face, then of course we'll accept the invitation.
we sometimes have used the language on the podcast here of, waking up or staying asleep, which I guess is somewhat similar language to, to hiding or to exploring the truth of this. I have this memory of when my mum in particular would wake me up to go to school when I was younger. And there were two curtains in my room, and she'd come in at 6:30 in the morning and open the first curtain to get me out of bed, and I would rotate the other way and roll over to where there was darkness the other side of the room. 20 minutes later, she'd open that curtain, and then there was nowhere to hide, and I had to get up. And it feels to me a little bit like this pandemic this year similarly has been opening a few curtains on us, and you can't hide in busyness this year. You can't hide in maybe the materialism you once could this year. You can't hide in even ambition, really, because who knows what careers are going to be ahead of you or when anything's going to really change. So some of the hiding places that culture has set up, that's, I think, the point Sue is making, is that none of us individually go out and construct these hiding places because we want to escape the call of what it is to be a human. We are brought into a system where the hiding places are built with flashing neon signs pointing us towards them collectively.
Yes.
But some of these hiding places have kind of crumbled a little bit this year. Do you think that is, at the moment and then ultimately in the decade or so to come, going to lead to people, inevitably more people than otherwise would have, exploring this work and exploring this question?
I think history encourages us to believe that, Dom. Obviously the pandemic has been appalling. It's going to kill 1 million people around the world, and many Australians will die from it, and others will be seriously ill, and families will be going through periods of grief and mourning as a result of the impact of this. But more broadly, I think the impact is going to be positive, because the impact of major crises and catastrophes generally is positive. We go back to the Brisbane floods. The most recent Brisbane floods brought out the best in most people, produced wonderful stories of not just bravery, but stories of compassion, kindness towards total strangers. The bushfires did the same thing. When the generation that's now mostly dead, who were in their early to mid adulthood during the Great Depression, when they look back on the Great Depression, they say that brought out the best in us. That really clarified our values. It was a terrible time. We wouldn't want to go through it again. Massive unemployment, a lot of people doing it really tough, but we discovered the value of the neighbourhood. We knew we had to look out for each other. We discovered the value of thrift, all sorts of things that stayed with that generation through life. They thought of themselves as the generation formed by the Depression in a good way, even though no one would say the experience was a good experience. Now, I think we'll have a COVID generation emerging from this who will have been shaped by the massive unemployment, by the correction to the mad rush of materialism that happened because we couldn't do all the spending that we normally do in the normal way, a curtailing of travel, causing people to think, well, actually, do we really need to take all those trips, especially when we now realise international flying is a sort of ecological vandalism, as well as a very efficient way of carting bugs around the world. A lot of people, I think, using this, people who would not normally have been introspective, including younger people who would normally have been in that identity building phase, have had an opportunity to think a bit more deeply about what really does matter to us. When the chips are down, what's really important? Now, I think this is one of those lovely, like one of Peter's magic moments in a way for the culture. It is a bit of a magic moment to have roughly 6 months of pressing the pause button, and it might be a lot more than 6 months, causing people, some people have got bored out of their minds, some people have become suicidal, some people have resorted to domestic violence. It's not all a pretty picture, but more generally, I think it's fair to say it's been a time of great introspection from which we will all be the beneficiaries. I don't think we'll go back to the situation where people will say rather sort of not smugly, but just kind of routinely, oh, we don't know our neighbours. You know, we have enough time keeping in touch, have enough trouble keeping in touch with our friends without worrying about the neighbours. I don't think you'll hear that again. We've discovered the importance of the neighbourhood, rediscovered it. And I think that's a lesson that will stay with us. We've discovered on a large scale something that's been creeping up on us for years, which is we don't have enough work for all the people who would like to work. And as a society, we have not been very generous or compassionate about that. Now, with so many people pitchforked into unemployment, which might go on for a year or two, as a society, we're going to have to, the stigma attached to unemployment is gone. And I don't think it'll come back in our lifetime, certainly not in my lifetime. So these, I think, are some, we'll be better citizens, we'll be better neighbours, we'll be better friends as a result of living through this experience.
I think I want to just touch on something you said before, Hugh, when we were talking about realising our inner self as basically compassionate and loving, and we have those examples from the fires and from the floods in Brisbane. I actually think if we're going to seize this magic moment that we're describing here, I think we need to shut off our ears to some of the media messaging, because we continue to believe these lies that basically, that you don't have to scratch a person too far and you'll find something nasty underneath. I think we need to actually believe our own lived experience more, because I'm sure almost all of us, if we tap into our lived experience, we may have one or two bad apples in there, but generally speaking, we will have recollections of strangers who've helped us, of times when we've left a handbag and someone's just rung us straight away and got it back to us, of times when people who have no reason to help us out have gone above and beyond. Those stories are everywhere, and yet you still hear this pervasive myth that we're basically nasty and that you can't trust people. But in Australia, and I think we've sort of bought into this idea of some of these national characteristics of mateship and so on, but we have missed the real characteristic of people who are genuinely kind-hearted, hospitable, and care for their neighbours. I found this true again and again, and I think we need to actually start pushing back a lot harder against the media messaging that is happening when we are reclaiming this magic moment right now.
Yes, thanks, Sue. I agree very strongly with that proposition. It's, in a way, it's, I suppose, the core theme of the book, that we are, because our essential nature is compassionate, therefore we are at our core good and kind and all those things, and we are not being true to ourselves so in other words, when humans are being truly human, they are acting well. When they're hiding from their true humanity, they're acting badly. That's not us. It's not as though we are a bad lot and we have to be carefully conditioned to behave well. It's the opposite. We are loving creatures. We belong to a social species, and every now and then, because of circumstances or an uncontrollable outbreak of egotism or whatever it might be, we behave badly. But behaving badly, that's the exception, absolutely. Some people behaved badly and selfishly at the beginning of the pandemic in response to a kind of blind panic. But very soon, our nobler, more truly human impulses prevailed. And I agree with you. We have to be very resistant and encourage each other to be very resistant to this idea that, two aspects of this, to this idea that humans are by nature bad and you have to work really hard to try and make them good. But also, when they are good, we've got to resist this idea that that's because they're Australian. I hate this idea. This is the Australian spirit. We're all behaving well because we're Australians. Canadians wouldn't do this. Canadians wouldn't do this. It's a terrible example of nationalism gone mad.
Yes.
And I think when you look at those 20 hiding places that you do list, and you do unpack them in more detail in the book, so heavily encourage people to track down a copy and see that it helps you have compassion for when those moments where people do act poorly or do act selfishly, whatever it is, because instead of seeing it as, their true character revealing itself, you can then just see it as they're coming from a different hiding place. You can almost see what that they're hiding, just like you have and continue to do, just like we all are, because facing the reality of love and compassion and justice and what it is to be a human is overwhelming. And I know you do go on to write in the book that underlying all our reasons for hiding from ourselves is our reluctance to face this question: what will be required of me if I get to the core of who I am? To be habitually loving as a daily discipline can seem a daunting prospect. To adopt compassion as a way of life takes courage. To live according to the dictates of the purest essence of self is a challenge. No wonder we sometimes feel like hiding, especially when there are so many comfortable hiding places on offer. I think it's a really lovely way of feeling compassion for, for the poor, because, the people who act poorly or act in a way that we don't think is the right way to act, because you just see that they've found a comfortable hiding place in the exact same way we continue to do as well.
Yes, absolutely. If that doesn't provoke feelings of compassion and empathy, then nothing will. The same as people often say, look, I don't know if I want to look inside myself because I might find too much dark stuff. Well, of course there's dark stuff, because there's light. Because the loving spirit is like the light within us. Yes, it does cast shadows. Yes, that's there. And when we, exactly as you've said, Don, when we see evidence in someone else that they are in a dark place, we need to recalibrate that, reframe it, and say, well, the loving spirit is still within them, but they're scared of the light. Plato had, I won't be able to give you the exact quote, I've used it in the book, but Plato had a wonderful quote that was something like, we can understand children who are afraid of the dark. The real tragedy is when grown-ups, he said men, but let's say grown-ups, when grown-ups are afraid of the light.
Yeah, that's a lovely way to sort of summarize it all, I suppose, in a way. And it's a deeply optimistic view of humanity, but as you said, Sue, it's not a naively, it's not naive. It's not just hoping that that's the truth, but actually when we honestly look at our lived experience, that is the truth we continually come back to, that more people generally have probably been kind to us than directly cruel to us. And, and similarly, when we look at people who have gone to the core of themselves, almost uniformly, they experience some encounter of love and connectedness. And a lot of the evil and pain of the world comes from those who are too afraid to go into the depth of themselves and act out of a shallower level of being. So, in a sense, I think that's just a point I want to make as we move towards wrapping up. Or a question I want to ask you, Hugh, is that this isn't, to some who might say, this is just an optimistic or an idealistic view of what it is to be a human, an idealistic view of the human race. That sort of cynical approach that would say, yeah, but actually it's all motivated by self-interest and self-desire when you get to the core of it. What would your response to that approach be?
Well, I think the evidence is overwhelmingly to the contrary. It's not motivated by self-interest. It's motivated by love. It's motivated by the light within. All the major religions of the world are devoted to this simple proposition, and Christianity, of course, we might say chief among them, that the compassion within, the capacity for love, is to be nurtured. What else is organised religion about except to encourage that? And given that about between 75 and 80% of the world's population identify with one of the world's major religions, that looks to me like a huge vote in favour of compassion. Even in Australia, where we talk about declining church membership and so on, still more than half the population identify as Christian, and about 2/3 of the population identify with some religion. That looks to me, again, like a vote in favour of the teachings, the values, the communities that will nurture our capacity for compassion. We want, by nature, to do well. We want to be good people, good parents, good partners, good neighbours, good citizens. That's the overwhelming. Even if I wasn't thinking about this philosophically, if I was just being a pragmatic social researcher, reflecting on 60 years of listening to Australians telling me their stories about various aspects of their lives, what's the overwhelming impression that I come away with when I reflect on all those conversations? The overwhelming impression is people want to do well. People are not intent on being destructive. They don't want to be bad neighbours or bad parents or any of that. They want to do well.
Yeah, and I suppose even when you look at those who maybe don't identify as religious, many of them will add in when they say that, oh, look, I like a lot of what Jesus spoke about. I just don't see that that's lived out in the life of the church. So it's not a rejection of the ideals of love and justice and compassion. Often a rejection of religion is a fierce stance alongside those and a feeling that religion isn't living them. Yeah. So, yeah, it's a really interesting point to look at it that way and to see humanity in that way.
Can I butt in there, Don? Because this morning, I think it was lovely that we're having this conversation today, because the lectionary gave us a bit of a gift this morning along these lines. That for those of us that were in church, we have Jesus saying, who do they say the Son of Man is? So he's using, for a start, is that title, the Son of Man, who was the human one, and when we're talking here about saying that the essence of being, when we talk about the essence of just loving is actually being our most human we can be. Jesus uses that title. He doesn't go for kingship titles. He goes for the human one. And of course, then he asks, who do you say that I am? So it was a lovely opportunity to unpack, having just been reading your book, Hugh, a lot of questions about finding and being not hiding from our inner self, because the inner self is the most human we can be, is also what Jesus was witnessing to in that title and in everything he did and said.
Yes, thank you for that.
And just one final question then to wrap up, Hugh. If if I was to ask you about your own personal journey and the ways in which you found the tools necessary to begin that journey inwards rather than into one of the hiding places, because it is hard, it can be daunting, and it can also be, sometimes very difficult to discern what is a call into our truest self and what is actually just another hiding place that was disguised. What were the tools, the approach? How did you go about that journey yourself?
I find that almost impossible to answer, Dom, because there's probably so many factors involved. But I think it's the trigger, given that I have a childhood, adolescence, young adulthood steeped in Christianity. So I had a kind of a cultural framework, if not at that early stage a religious or spiritual framework, but at least a cultural framework for thinking of the world in this way. But I think the specific trigger has been a very vivid, specific awareness of the needs of neighbours. Neighbours in the broader sense, neighbours, friends, people that I encounter. So many people becoming terminally ill. This was when I was in my 50s and early 60s, or dealing with crippling illnesses that were going to be with them, really being in trouble and needing help and support. I think that, and realising how much help and support is forthcoming when someone's need is obvious. That's when I think I really started to get, in a very personal way, the idea that that's why we're here.
Yeah. Well, Hugh, it's been a treat to spend an hour talking with you. Thank you so much for making time to join the podcast.
Great pleasure. Thanks very much, Tom. Thank you, Peter and Sue.
Thank you.
And we will be back with another episode of the On the Way podcast shortly.